Welcome to the chilling world of the unexplained, where shadows dance in the dark and echoes of the past linger in the air. In today's episode, we delve into the haunting history of a house that has seen more than its share of terror. From unexplainable phenomena to spine-tingling encounters, prepare yourself as we explore the eerie events that unfolded within these walls. Join us as we uncover the stories of those who lived there. Stories that will leave you questioning what lies beyond our understanding. Are you ready to confront the darkness? I'm not going to disclose the specifics of the house or its exact location. Even now, people still live there, and I don't wish to cause them any distress from this story being shared. What I can tell you is that the house lies several miles outside of town, far from the busy streets, hidden down a quiet side road. A row of tall trees stands between the house and the main road, almost as if it's meant to be kept secret. This road is shared by just two other homes, both isolated farmhouses with significant distance between them. Beyond that, there's nothing but farmland, as far as the eye can see. The house itself, a modest home, 3 bedrooms, 1 bath. The main parking area connects to a basement garage, though there's also a separate garage in the back, complete with its own driveway. The yard is vast, shaded by large trees with a peaceful little stream flowing nearby. My parents decided to move here to be closer to the rest of our family. We had been living in a small, cramped 2-bedroom apartment a few counties away. But for my mother, this was more than just a new home. This was her dream. Having grown up on a farm, she'd always felt out of place in the middle of town, living in an apartment. Here, she could finally have the life she always wanted. The yard was perfect, a large open space where she could plant a vegetable garden, while still leaving enough room for us kids to run and play all summer long. And the house was spacious enough to host parties and family gatherings. It quickly became the go-to place for celebrations, before the problems started creeping in. Problems that eventually became impossible to ignore. We moved into the house in the autumn of 1980. During the initial tour, my parents noticed something, but at the time it seemed unimportant. The owner had kept the thermostat almost off to save on energy, so the whole house was chilly, not much warmer than the crisp autumn air outside. It was easy to overlook the fact that the far back bedroom felt colder than the rest. At first, it seemed like a simple draft, but that room, no matter the season, was always unnervingly cold. Even during the heat of summer, it was so frigid that my mother swore she could see her breath. This room quickly became the center of everything strange that happened in the house. It was as if whatever lingered there, whatever was behind the events, always returned to the ice-like chill of that far-back bedroom. But aside from the unsettling cold, only one major incident ever happened inside that room. When we first moved in, my parents chose the cold back bedroom as their own. In the early days, my aunt often came over to help us unpack and settle in. On one particular afternoon, my mother and my aunt decided to take a break and laid down on the bed to rest. And then, it happened. Without warning, it felt as though the bed began to lift from the floor. Several inches, it seemed, and then fell back to the hardwood floor with a loud thud. Frozen in terror, they didn't move, unsure of what was happening, too afraid to believe it. Eventually, their fear overtook them. They jumped from the bed and bolted out of the room, hearts pounding in their chests. As soon as my stepfather returned from work, my mother demanded that he move the furniture into the adjacent bedroom. From that day on, that cold back bedroom was never used for anything but storage. We left it untouched, as though it had become something other than a part of our home. I don't remember this myself, but according to my parents, I used to complain about something strange when I was around 8 years old. I would ask them, on more than one occasion, to stop coming into my room at night and making funny faces over my bed. But of course, they hadn't been coming into my room at all. And then there was the matter of the carpet and the basement door. The living room and hallway were covered in a beautiful plush white carpet. My mother had a habit of vacuuming it in a specific pattern, carefully arranging the lines to enhance its appearance. It was so plush, in fact, that even the lightest footsteps left clear impressions. On more occasions than I can count, we'd return home after running errands or visiting family to find something unsettling. The basement door, usually locked, would be standing wide open, and scattered across the pristine white carpet were footprints. My stepfather was convinced the landlord had been letting himself into the house while we were gone, but when confronted, the landlord denied it, adamantly. We always locked the basement door when we left, since the garage and basement were practically one space. So how was it possible that the door kept opening on its own? One day, while vacuuming the carpet, my mother noticed some footprints where she had just cleaned. Assuming they were her own, she backed up and went over them again. But as she worked her way back into the living room, she froze. The footprints had reappeared, only this time, they were moving. Right before her eyes, footprints were forming in the plush carpet, moving slowly down the hallway. But no one was there. The only other person home at the time was my 3-year-old brother. Without hesitating, my mother scooped him up in her arms and bolted outside, waiting there until my stepfather and I came home, him from work and me from school. He, being the skeptic that he was, saying she just saw her own footprints. In her panic, my mother had left the vacuum running. It sat in the same spot for over 4 hours. By the time my stepfather arrived, it was completely burned out, rendered useless. On more than one occasion, my mother spoke of something entering their bedroom late at night. But there was one night in particular, a night that she would never forget. It began with her waking up for no apparent reason. The house was quiet, but soon from the hallway she began to hear it. Heavy breathing. And something else. The faint sound of sharp toenails catching in the carpet and being pulled free one by one. The sounds were getting closer. Panicked, she tried to wake my dad, but he wouldn't stir, deeply asleep and completely unaware of the approaching presence. Fear took hold of her, and she squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the blanket over her head, all while praying desperately for protection. The breathing grew louder, the strange scratching of nails in the carpet closer, until it was in the room with her. She felt the weight of something settle on the foot of the bed, as though it had climbed up and was watching her. Then she felt it, her blanket being pulled, inch by inch, as the thing tried to uncover her face. She kept her eyes closed, terrified to see what had come for her. She could feel her blanket slipping away, her face slowly being exposed to the cold night air. And then, she felt it. A breath. Hot. Deliberate. Something blew directly into her face, twice. Still praying, my mother clung desperately to the blanket, trying to pull it back, but whatever had hold of it was far stronger than she was. In a moment of quick thinking, she decided to let go, hoping that by releasing her grip, the thing would lose its balance and fall backwards off the bed. But as soon as she let go, so did it. The blanket dropped harmlessly onto her chest, as though nothing had ever happened. The room fell silent. The visitor was gone. Shaking and weeping, she finally managed to wake my dad, but he simply dismissed it. A bad dream, he said. Nothing more. But my mother knew. She knew what she had felt, and that it had been all too real. My uncle had barely survived a devastating tornado years before this time. Nothing was left of his house, aside from a few pipes poking out of the ground. Had he not been fortunate enough to own a shelter, he would not have made it. Since that day, tornadoes have haunted my family, striking fear into their hearts whenever stormy weather rolled in. One summer night in 1981, the weather was turning dangerous, with multiple tornado sightings reported in the area. Everyone in our immediate family gathered at our house, not because it felt safer, but because we were the only ones with a basement. What followed that night, however, left us all far more terrified than the storm raging outside. The night began with strange sounds. Someone mentioned seeing something, or someone, moving outside the house. My uncle, ever the brave one, went out to investigate. He was gone for several minutes. When he came back, his face was pale, confused. He asked us a question none of us expected. "Why are you all in the basement?" We stared at him, bewildered, and assured him that none of us had gone downstairs. But he was adamant. He had seen several people down there, lights on, and heard noises that sounded like praying, or maybe chanting. Determined to understand what was happening, my uncle opened the basement door and peered inside. The basement was dark, empty, and eerily quiet. Throughout the night, more unsettling things happened. The basement door refused to stay closed, no matter how many times we shut it. Everyone had brought sleeping bags, and despite the unnerving events, we all decided to spend the night in the basement, just in case the storm brought a tornado our way. But that storm wasn't the only thing we had to fear. By morning, the air had finally calmed. My mother went upstairs and found my grandfather in the kitchen, making coffee. But something was wrong. He looked troubled, distant. When my mother asked him what was bothering him, he hesitated. Finally, he looked at her and said in a low, serious voice, "I'll tell you later what I saw." Earlier that same summer, my grandfather had been spending a lot of time in the garage working on a truck he'd recently bought, one he planned to use for hauling. He was a large, tough man, someone who wasn't easily shaken. But on more than one occasion, he would come into the house visibly unsettled. Each time, he'd glance nervously over his shoulder, as though something had followed him. But no matter how much we asked, he refused to say what had him so on edge. Whatever he experienced out there, it had unnerved him in a way nothing else ever had. Then, there was the night of my step-grandmother's visit. She spent the night in one of the bedrooms, unaware of the strange things that had already happened in the house. But by the next morning, she shared her own chilling encounter. Something had entered her room during the night. She felt it brush against her uncovered arm, and immediately, fear took hold. Like my mother, she refused to open her eyes, too terrified to see what was lurking beside her bed. But she didn't need to see it to know what it was. Whatever it was very, very hairy. That night left her shaken, and like so many others who experienced the house's dark presence, she chose not to return. The basement in the house served more than one purpose. It wasn't just a garage, it was also where my mother did the laundry. One day, while she was folding clothes, my little brother, who was 3 years old at the time, was playing nearby with his toys. She stepped upstairs for just a moment to grab some hangers, leaving him alone in the basement. When she returned, she found him happily playing on our spring rocking horse. The odd thing was, my brother had always needed help getting onto that horse. He was a husky child, and there was no way he could climb up on his own. Naturally, she asked him, "How did you get up there?" His response chilled her to the core. He simply said, "The doctors." A little while later, on another day, my mom was cleaning the house. As usual, she found herself repeatedly closing the basement door. It never seemed to stay shut. At one point, she caught my brother standing in the doorway, staring down the stairs. She warned him, as any mother would, to stay away from the stairs so he wouldn't fall, then closed the door again. But moments later, he came into the kitchen, tugging at her hand. "Come here, Mommy. Come here," he urged. Thinking he was just playing a game, she asked, "What is it?" He pointed at the basement door. "The doctors want you," he said. Still not fully grasping what he meant, she asked, "Where did they come from?" His answer was as strange as it was unnerving. From the wall. Now growing nervous, she pressed on. "What do they look like?" she asked. With surprising detail for a 3-year-old, my brother described them. "They wear blue clothes and a mask, and they stand like this." He raised his hands in the air, mimicking the way a doctor would after scrubbing in for surgery. Mom's nerves turned to outright fear. "What do they want?" she asked. My brother, without hesitation, pointed at her stomach and replied, "They want your baby." Shaken, my mother tried to calm him, saying, "But you are my baby." But he just shook his head and pointed again at her stomach. "No, that baby." It wasn't until after we moved from the house that my mother discovered she was pregnant with my sister. After almost a year of strange and terrifying occurrences, my mother finally convinced my stepfather that it was time to leave the house. We moved out, but not without leaving behind more questions than answers. One question lingered heavily over all of us, the question of what my grandfather saw that night in our basement during the storm. For the rest of his life, my grandfather refused to speak of it. Anytime the subject was brought up, he would either leave the room or fall into an eerie silence. Years after he had passed, my grandmother finally revealed what he had confided in her after they returned home that day. It was a story so horrifying that it haunted him until the end of his life. That night, my grandfather was lying on his air mattress in the basement, still awake, listening to the storm raging outside. The wind howled and the rain pounded, but then he heard something else. Hard, knocking footsteps, slowly descending the basement stairs. The basement was cloaked in darkness. He could see nothing, but the sound of the footsteps grew louder as they reached the bottom of the stairs. Then, stepping into the dim light, he saw it. The creature had the legs of a goat, complete with hooves. Its upper body was humanoid, except for the excessive hair, the clawed hands, and the red glowing eyes. But the most terrifying feature? Large, twisted horns protruding from its head. My grandfather, a man who feared nothing, was frozen. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the creature. The figure scanned the room, almost as if it were searching for something, or someone. Then, it looked directly at him. They locked eyes. For what felt like an eternity, my grandfather stared into the red, glowing eyes of this beast, unable to move, unable to speak. And then, without a sound, the figure stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. The creature he described matches the mythological Pan, the satyr, and even the goat-like demons such as Azazel, entities mentioned in ancient texts and biblical scripture. Even Satan himself has been described with such goat-like features. Whatever it was that my grandfather saw that night, it was not of this world. And though he never spoke of it again, the memory of that creature haunted him until the day he died. As we close the door on the chilling tales of this haunted house, we're left with more questions than answers. What truly lurked in the shadows of those rooms? What dark secrets were hidden within those walls? If you've ever experienced something paranormal, we want to hear your story. Did you encounter a chilling presence or perhaps a mysterious figure that left you questioning reality? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story could resonate with someone else who has faced the unexplainable. And remember, if you enjoyed these spine-tingling tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories that explore the mysterious and the unknown. Who knows what other haunted legends await us? Thank you for joining us on this journey into the dark. Until next time, keep your lights on and your doors locked.